and welcome to week 12 of the CRICKETher Vodcast in social isolation. Last week we were at Worcester for England versus Pakistan in 2016, I believe it was. This week we've done something a little bit different. We've hijacked Sky's pod. They weren't using it. There's no cricket currently being played, so we strapped it to the back of our Austin Metro. We don't really have an Austin Metro. And
I don't even know what you're talking about.
we've driven it to a well-known county ground. But where have we driven it to? Where are we this week in the Sky Pod? Right, well, in a week in which the Black Lives Matter protests have erupted around the world, it's a week where it's important for society to reflect and ask itself some hard questions. So we thought it was time for us to do the same and ask ourselves some hard questions about the sport that we work in and live in. And perhaps the most appropriate of those hard questions is, does women's cricket have a race problem? Raf?
Well, the first thing I want to say here is that I think we're both a little bit nervous about talking about this, aren't we? We think it's important, but we're both white, obviously, and therefore I guess we want to kind of preface the whole discussion by acknowledging our privilege and saying that it's difficult for us to understand, or impossible for us to understand what it actually is to be a woman of colour playing cricket in this country. So I just wanted to kind of start by saying that. But as you say, we think it's really important to ask that question, is there a race problem in women's cricket? I have kind of previously written about this a little bit, researched it a little bit, and I think the answer is essentially yes, there is. There's a problem with sport, there's a problem with cricket specifically, and then there are problems within women's cricket as well. And I think, well, I guess the obvious place to start is the England men's team has recently been held up as this kind of beacon of diversity and a reflection of kind of modern multicultural Britain. If you look at the England women's team, is it diverse? Not really. We've only ever had 2 black women represent England. One of them, Ebony Rainford-Brent, who made her debut in 2001, and then more recently we've seen Sophia Dunkley represent England, and hopefully she'll go on and have a kind of long, successful international career. And then from the Asian community, we've had Isha Guha and Sonia Adeja, who's only ever played 1 match. So you can count the women of colour who have represented England on the fingers of one hand, literally. And that is not a reflection of modern multicultural Britain. That's actually quite a shocking statistic, really. And then...
Now, saying that we obviously have a race problem, it's important, right, to distinguish that from saying that individual people are racist. Right? That what we're not saying here is that, for instance, the coaches that select the England team are racist, right? Nobody's making that accusation.
No, it's not about individuals, is it? It's not about pointing the finger at particular people and saying you're racist, you're racist, you're racist. It's actually something more insidious than that. It's structural racism, which is basically racism that operates across the entire sport at a kind of structural, institutional level. And that's much harder to tackle, because if it's individuals, if there are particular coaches that you think are problematic, particular journalists, particular players you think are problematic, then you can kind of take them out of the game, put them in a corner, point at them and go, oh, you're bad, you're racist, and then feel very comfortable that everything's fine. Systemic racism is really difficult to tackle because, as I say, it runs across all levels of the sport, and you can't just tackle it overnight like that. You can't root it out very easily. So I think it would be easier if it was an individual problem, but it's not. It's something much harder to tackle than that. I was going to go on and say that actually even beneath the England level, if you look at women's county cricket, there are very few non-white women playing women's county cricket as well. I guess Middlesex would probably be the kind of exception to that rule. They do much more reflect the multicultural population that their county represents. But generally speaking, women's cricket is still very white in this country and always has been.
Now, there was a fascinating article in this week's New Statesman by Gary Young, looking at the issue of COVID-19 deaths and about whether there were race elements to that, and looking at the kind of the intersection between race and class, and looking at how there's a sort of structural bias in society which is tied up with class and wealth and opportunity and privilege and all of those things. So are they the same kinds of things that are playing out here in women's cricket, Raf?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think it is very much tied in with class. We know that black women or black girls tend to be more likely to grow up in poverty, to have less good educational outcomes. Black women tend to be more likely to work in minimum wage jobs. And there's no doubt, there's no getting away from the fact that cricket is a sport that requires an investment, a financial investment. It's not something that you can play to any good level without, a bat, pads, etc., etc. And it has, and women's cricket has therefore been dominated and remains dominated by people with a bit of money, the middle classes basically. So that's certainly an element to it. If you wanted to take a couple of examples that kind of illustrate that, you could look at somebody like Ebony Rainford-Brent, who acknowledges that she basically fell into cricket kind of by accident, really, growing up in Brixton in the 90s. The only reason she ever encountered cricket was because there was a charity who were taking and running cricket sessions at inner city London schools, and they came along to her school, and she was all right, so they said, oh, why don't you go along to trials? She went along to trials, and she was selected, but it would have been very difficult for her kind of growing up in a single parent household with not much money to spare. So one of the women who was working for this particular organisation, this particular charity, kind of took Ebony under her wing and said, right, I'm going to drive you to all the places you need to get to all the trials, the matches that you need to get to, and I'm going to help you apply for grants so that you can afford to do this. And Ebony really did kind of rely on that support. Now, I know this because I interviewed her for my PhD, and she went into the details about it, and she's also spoken about this publicly. But for her, it was very much a kind of a way in by luck. And then if you maybe looked at Sophia Dunkley more recently, she kind of grew up playing cricket in her cul-de-sac because her neighbour played, and then was fortunate to win a scholarship to a public school, to Mill Hill School in London, and which has great cricketing resources. But if you are a kind of average girl of colour who, you would, if you're going to a state school, then you're very unlikely to encounter cricket. You won't have the access to those same kind of facilities. And then, so your route in generally as a girl would be through the club system. But the club system has, it's tended to be, in a way, club cricket is a kind of perpetuating cycle, because often clubs are sustained by families, and if you don't have that family connection with a club, and if you turn up at a cricket club and you don't know anyone, and I guess if you're black and you're a female and you turn up and there aren't very many people who look like you, and there aren't very many other women around, then that's kind of doubly intimidating. So in kind of academic feminism, we talk about intersectionality. So it's these different kind of levels of your identity, or these different aspects of your identity all come together. So in this case, it would be your gender, it would be your class, and it would also be your race that would all come together and make it kind of very difficult for you to become involved in cricket. And that's kind of what I mean when I'm talking about sort of systemic racism, just that cricket as a sport being hard to access and being something that isn't necessarily appealing, because it is and kind of remains dominated by white people, and I guess by white men as well. So there's a cricket problem, but I think there's a more specifically women's cricket problem as well.
Okay, thank you, Raf. There's some important stuff for us all to reflect on, and for all to try and do those small things in life that can, help to correct those problems, as well as, kind of structurally addressing them. Thanks, Raf. Okay, well, moving on. There have been some little bits of news this week. We've seen Meg Lanning has done a big interview over in Australia talking about the WBBL. We seem to have lots of bits of information dripping out about the WBBL, almost as if they're kind of running things up the flagpole to see if they'll fly. So we seem to have moved on a little bit from where we were. We discussed last week the possibility of the WBBL season being shortened. That looks to be something the players didn't want and has now been thrown out the window. But now we've got a different plan to try and save money. What's that plan all about, Raf?
Yeah, well, Meg Lanning's done this interview where she suggested that something that's being discussed is a return to double headers. What we've seen recently is women's cricket in Australia and the WBBL specifically kind of moving away from that double header format. So last season the WBBL had its own standalone window. It was played at a different time completely separately from the men's BBL. But the implication in this article, and certainly they had a producer from Fox Sports saying that it's cheaper from a production cost perspective to run double header matches, so run 2 games, the women's and then the men's back to back. And Meg Lanning was kind of saying, we've been fighting this battle to try and stop them reducing the number of fixtures, so maybe double headers is the way to go if that's a way that we can kind of shore up the WBBL schedule. What do you make of it all, Syd? We've been a bit, or certainly I've been quite outspoken about my views about double headers in the past and suggesting that they've potentially outlived their usefulness.
Well, if it really does keep the matches on TV, if that's the difference, if Australia is saying we just can't, if they're saying we can't afford to film and live stream all of the WBBL matches, the only way that we could make this work was by either cutting out the live streams or doing them as double headers, then I think at that point it does become a no-brainer. I do wonder how much costs you'll really save, because of course if you're a cameraman that's filming the men's BBL match and they ask you to come 4 hours earlier to film the women's match, you're not going to go, right, mate, I'll do that for free.
Oh God, you've just done your Australian. Apologies to any genuine Australians watching.
But they're not going to, and nor is anybody else. I would imagine the presenters are going to have contracts which say I work this many hours, and if you want me to work an extra 4 hours, you're going to have to pay me for an extra 4 hours. So the costs aren't zero, and the costs of live streaming the WBBL matches, which what they generally do, are obviously less than the cost of broadcasting a men's match on kind of real television, because they use a slightly lower quality cameras, they use fewer cameras, they've got less production costs there. So I don't know how much money it will really save them, but if it does save them enough money to allow us to continue to get up at 4 a.m. and watch some WBBL during our bleak cold winter, which maybe the next cricket that we can actually watch, then that would be a good thing.
I think actually it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with that in the coming weeks, because the Australian Cricketers Association is apparently looking to tackle some of these assessments by Cricket Australia, these kind of financial assessments, and is kind of saying, well, hang on a minute, we haven't lost any of our season, we don't know that we will lose any of our season, why have your financial forecasts been so bad? And the women we know are represented on the Australian Cricketers Association quite well, so it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as a result of those conversations as well, I think.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a lot of concern among the players, because a lot of the agreements that made were effectively profit share agreements, and the profits seem to have all disappeared, and now they're looking for perhaps to try and make an alternative for that. And,
they don't like the model anymore.
A profit share is great when you're making profits. It's less great when you're not, and then you might want to ask those questions. So, we'll find out more as we go, I guess. What about back here in England, Raf? The domestic retainers should have been in place for a week now. As far as we're aware, they are in place. Yeah. Certainly nobody's complained to us that they're not, and I would have thought that we would have heard on the grapevine if they weren't. But where do we stand with the contracts? Because you've been having a few chats with people, in the background this week. I don't know how much you're allowed to say about that. Tell us what you can.
Probably not much. I think the main thing is that both the retainers and the full domestic contracts that will be kicking in later in the summer, hopefully, are being run past our equivalent of the Australian Cricketers Association. So the Professional Cricketers Association in this country are currently looking at those contracts. I believe they're looking at both the terms and conditions of the retainers and then also the terms and conditions of the full contracts. And that's kind of the reason, apparently, why we haven't had a list announced of who has got a retainer, because we don't know who's got them. We could probably make a good stab at it, but we don't know for sure who's been awarded them. So I think those conversations are very interesting. We pointed out in the CRICKETher piece that we published, saying that 18,000 a year for a full Centre of Excellence contract is actually a long way below the PCA's mandated minimum wage of 27,500. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see, therefore, what the PCA say about all this publicly. So yes, it's a kind of bit of a wait and see. In terms of who's got the retainers, that will also be interesting, because we know that the ECB have been pushing for them to be awarded to a kind of priority system where you go, right, who's most likely to play for England in the next 12 to 18 months? But from the regional directors' perspective, who we think are the people who have kind of got the power here in terms of they were the ones who were meant to be selecting the people getting the retainers. So your regional director is not necessarily going to have the same order of priorities as the ECB. Certainly if I was a regional director, I'd be sitting there going, right, who am I potentially going to lose in the next few months if I don't give them a retainer? Who might walk away from cricket altogether? And that doesn't necessarily overlap with the person who's going to be most likely to play for England in the next few months. So I'm really interested to hear who's actually been awarded one of those retainers.
Okay, well, we might find that out in the next week, if not, hopefully the week after.
Hopefully.
Okay, well, that's all for this week. Thank you for watching. We will see you back here, same place, same time. Well, not in the Sky Pod. Obviously, we have to give it back to Sky before anybody notices. But somewhere else in a week's time. Until then, take care of you and yours. We'll take care of us and ours. And we'll see you then.
Bye.